You've got a parliament where most of the public, or a good half of the public, does not see itself reflected. Then you look at the MPs that we send there. What do they actually get to do? There's data from the Samara Center, which studies these things, that shows, in a typical parliament, MPs vote with their party 99.6% of the time. So MPs are basically not representing us. They're representing the party to us. They are foot soldiers and spokesmen for the parties, and that's about it.
During his historic 2025 speech from the throne, delivered in the Senate chamber of the Canadian Parliament, King Charles III, Canada's head of state, identified democracy as being one of the country's enduring values. In 2024, U.S. News and World Report ranked Canada as the second best country to live on Earth, citing its political stability and democratic governance. In that same year, the Economist Intelligence Unit ranked Canada 14th globally in their Democracy Index. To much of the world, Canada is a beacon of democracy. But is it really? Do Canadians actually live in the much ballyhooed system they think they do? Has Canada been resting on its democratic laurels? I'm Adrian Harewood, and this is In Bed with the Elephant. Parliament is not a mere rubber stamp for the government of the day. It is the very essence of democratic self-government, and if it ceases to perform that role, Canadian democracy is in danger. Those were the words of the late Eugene Forsey, a Canadian original. Born in 1904, Forsey was a senator, incisive public affairs critic, and one of Canada's foremost constitutional scholars. An advocate of the Westminster system, he was a champion of parliamentary democracy and sought to educate Canadians about how it worked so that they would revere and defend it. To Eugene Forsey, Parliament was the place where the people's representatives held the government to account, where brilliant politicians like former Conservative Prime Minister Arthur Meighen held court and wowed Canadians with their spellbinding oratory. Forsey lived in an era where Parliament still mattered. Andrew Coyne laments for today's Canadian nation. He argues that democracy in Canada is in peril. He says Parliament has become increasingly irrelevant to Canadians, and that MPs and even cabinet ministers have become lightweights, placeholders, playthings of prime ministers. Coyne believes we could be governing ourselves better, and that Canada's democratic institutions need to be revitalized and reimagined to regain their legitimacy. Andrew Coyne has been one of Canada's most formidable and free-thinking political commentators since the early 1990s. He currently writes for the Globe and Mail and is a charter member of CBC's At Issue panel, Canada's most watched weekly politics panel. He's just published a new book called The Crisis of Canadian Democracy. Andrew Coyne, thanks so much for joining us on In Bed with the Elephant.
Nice to be with you.
It's great to chat with you, and I feel as if I've been reading your work since I was a boy in short pants. So
Thank you for making me feel old.
So it's an honor to have this opportunity to sit down and chat with you. Andrew, on page 242 of your book, just 6 pages from the end of The Crisis of Canadian Democracy, you write that we remain one of the richest, freest, fairest, most blessed places on Earth. You're of course referring to Canada there. And yet prior to that, for some 200 pages, you're making the argument that Canadian democracy is in crisis. How do you square these two seemingly contradictory ideas?
Well, we had a great constitutional inheritance. We were founded at a time of great democratic ferment. And the structure of what was built was pretty good. Not perfect, but pretty good. But it's been 150 odd years, and we've allowed a lot of those things to deteriorate. A lot of the conventions and principles in which we're governed have deteriorated. So we're kind of coasting on past glories, if you will. And look, we've got some things right about our politics and our political culture. Our elections aren't actually fixed. They're not corrupted. People aren't standing over you with a baseball bat telling you how to vote. But the other thing is we have a good, healthy democratic culture, at least compared to some other countries. We don't view each other as the enemy. We don't seek revenge when we get into power. The disinformation scourge, while present in our politics, has not gone to anything like the same extent as some other places. And because we've succeeded on a lot of other fronts, there doesn't seem to be the same appetite for extremist voices. None of these things should blind us to the fact that we could be governing ourselves in a much more democratic manner. And I would say, I think you make a strong case, not just a more democratic manner, but a better governance model.
So is the word crisis an exaggeration?
I don't think so. I think when you look, let's just take what we've just been through in the last 6 months. We're in the middle of what many people agree is an existential crisis where the president of the United States, our nearest neighbor, closest ally, major trading partner, and historic protector, is suddenly talking more like an adversary than a friend, threatening to annex us, et cetera. And in the middle of this crisis, Parliament sits dark for 6 months and nobody cares. That's extraordinary. Usually in a crisis, people turn to their elected leaders to give voice to their fears, to thrash through solutions and approaches to the problems that are facing the country. Nobody turned to Parliament. Parliament has so dwindled in relevance that people can't even remind themselves why they should care. So we're in a kind of a vicious circle there. And when Parliament becomes irrelevant, when MPs that we elect to the Parliament, when they're no longer seen as actually representing us or holding the government to account, a lot of other things flow from that. One is that the federal government, the government that is supposed to look after our national interests as opposed to merely provincial interests, doesn't feel it has the legitimacy to do so. It hesitates to tackle the provinces because too many people in our country, with some justice, look at the federal government and the federal parliament and just refer to it as Ottawa, this far off place they send MPs to and they're never heard from again. So that crisis of legitimacy, therefore, has knock on effects in terms of the federal government's efficacy. And we're seeing the fruits of that right now. We're seeing provinces passing just flagrantly unconstitutional bills, beating up on their minorities, and the federal government doesn't feel it can say boo to try to stop them. So there's a couple of examples where what might seem like an academic or a textbook exercise has real world consequences.
Well, let's dig in because you say that the parliament that we elect in Canada does not represent us in any meaningful way. Can you give us some examples of that? Like, why doesn't it represent us? Because people will say, they vote in elections, their MPs go and make the case for their constituencies. Why are you saying things are so dire?
Well, let's start with the elections themselves. We elect a parliament each election that doesn't look anything like what we voted for. The number of seats that parties win bears no resemblance oftentimes to the proportion of the vote they got. I'll give you a classic example. In 1993, the Conservatives, the Bloc, and the Reform Party all got roughly the same share of the vote, about 16% of the vote. The Bloc and the Reform each got 50 plus seats. The Conservatives got 2 seats. So, if a party clumps its vote geographically, it gets many more seats proportionally than a party with the same number of votes, but it's spread more evenly. Well, the basic disproportion that leads to that is at the riding level. We elect one member per riding. We think of that as the norm. It's actually unusual. Most countries have multi-member ridings. The effect of having one member ridings is a candidate gets elected with, let's say, 30% of the vote. The other 70% of the vote basically goes unrepresented. I know that the MP legally represents the riding and everybody in it, but in terms of representing their views, 70% of the people who trudge the polls don't elect anybody. When you add it up over all of the seats in an election, typically more than half of the votes aren't really counted. They don't actually going to elect anybody. So start from there. You've got a parliament where most of the public, or a good half of the public, does not see itself reflected, is not represented in it. Then you look at the MPs that we send there. What do they actually get to do? What are the traditional things we think of as MPs doing? They don't really propose legislation as they do in the Congress or as they do in other parliaments. We pass maybe 2, 3 private members' bills each year. Most MPs will go through their entire career without ever seeing any legislation they propose passed. Debating on legislation, it doesn't really affect anything. The debates, typically their speeches are written for them. So that's really not much of a muchness anymore. And then finally, they vote on legislation. Well, there's data from the Samara Center, which studies these things, that shows, in a typical parliament, MPs vote with their party 99.6% of the time. A far greater level of party discipline than in any comparable democracy. So MPs are basically not representing us. They're representing the party to us. They are foot soldiers and spokesmen for the parties, and that's about it.
Why has this happened? Because I would imagine there was a time when MPs played perhaps a different role?
Yes. I mean, if you go back, and there was never a perfect golden age, of course, but if you go back to the early days of Confederation, parties had much less control over MPs. They were much more likely to buck the party line, not always for wholesome reasons, but certainly they had more independence. One of the big landmarks was in 1919 when the Liberal Party elected their leader for the first time by a convention rather than by the members of caucus.
You're talking about Mackenzie King.
Mackenzie King. And they were followed about 8 years later by the Conservatives. And ever since then, we've done some version of that. It sounds more democratic. Let's spread the vote out to everybody in the party. Of course, when you look at how it actually operates, it's not the party members, it's the party members plus the hundreds of thousands that are signed up, instant members in the course of the campaign, who hang around for one day to vote and are never seen again. But even if it were, those party members have very limited ability to hold a leader to account after they've voted. One of the themes of the book is democracy is not just what happens on election day, it's what happens every day in between. The old way that we chose leaders was the caucus chose the leader. And when the caucus chooses the leader, and by the way, the caucus could also remove the leader, then that made the leader have to pay really close attention to the caucus and making sure that their concerns were being addressed and could really be held to account for them. When the leader has to be accountable to caucus that way, I would argue that's much more democratic than what we've seen time and time again, which is once the leader's got this mandate from the membership, he can basically just thumb his nose at the caucus. But oftentimes we'll see leaders get stuck in there long after their sell-by date. It's clear to everybody they have to go, but there's really no mechanism for removing them. So that was one thing. The other big step was in 1970 when we changed the electoral law to say that nominees for each party had to have the approval of the party leader to be able to stand as a candidate. So rather than the caucus choosing the leader, basically the leader chooses the caucus. The leader, nobody can run without the leader's approval. Most of the time, or at least half the time, candidates are appointed by the leader in the first place. They're not elected in competitive local nomination races. But then once they're in, even if they're longtime incumbents, they're utterly dependent on the leader's favor if they want to run again. So the combined effect of taking away the caucus's power to choose the leader and giving the leader this life or death power over the nominations of the MPs, plus all the powers that the leader and the leader apparatus have to give out favors to advance your career or retard your career, it's just left caucus members essentially in a very servile role. So if you're willing to stand as a candidate, you're probably pretty okay with this role. If you do have a kind of rebellious streak, you'll get weeded out. You won't get the nomination. If you do somehow slip through, it'll get beaten out of you once you get to Ottawa, and not just by the party leadership, but by your fellow MPs, all of whom have graduated from the same system and want nothing to do with any rebels who are going to rock the boat and get in the way of their chances of advancement.
Because the argument is that really it should be the membership that's choosing the party leader. And if the members of the party choose the party leader, that's more democratic.
Well, as I say, it's the members can't hold the leader to account day by day. There's a leadership review, but only after they lose an election in which he's the only candidate and he only has to get 2/3 of the vote typically. It's not a very effective means of holding to account. But the other thing I would say is that for people who want more local democracy and more power to the members, let's clean up the way in which we elect MPs. If MPs were more clearly seen to be the choice of the local riding association, then I think people would assign them more legitimacy to then be able to choose the leader. As it stands, as I mentioned, half the time candidates are appointed by the party leader. The remainder of the cases where there's a race, most of the time the races are decided by acclamation, i.e., there's only one candidate because everybody knows who's going to win. In the very few cases where, less than 1 in 5, where they're actually contested with more than one candidate, that's when you get the worst shenanigans with, busloads of instant members there and people staffing meetings. So, we really need to clean up the nomination race, partly for that reason, so that we'll have more legitimacy vested in MPs and therefore maybe make more of a case for giving them more power. But also, of course, as we've seen in recent times, the nomination races have become the point of vulnerability for foreign interference. It's hard to fix or to rig an actual election at the riding level in Canada because of the paper ballot system. But it's really easy, as we've seen, to smuggle people in and get your candidate chosen at the nomination level. And in a safe riding, as too many of our ridings are, then that ultimately really decides who goes to Parliament.
So you say that MPs are effectively nobodies. They have become irrelevant within this system. You also suggest that cabinet ministers no longer have the kind of power that they once had. The days of strong ministers, I'm thinking of someone like an Alan McKechnie or Herb Gray, folks of that ilk, or Don Mazinkowski as well, like
Sure.
with
Or
Maroney.
go back further, C.D. Howe.
C.D.
These
Howe.
people,
Those days are
um,
gone. What's happened to the cabinet minister? Why don't cabinet ministers have the kind of heft, perhaps, that they once had?
well, it's sad, first of all, because getting into cabinet is one of the main instruments of party discipline. Right? That's how caucus members are kept in line, is they'll suffer any abuse and any humiliation for years on end, because they say, if I just endure this, someday I'll get into cabinet. And then they get into cabinet and they find that they're basically still nobodies. They're just nobodies with a car and driver. The real key index of this is, if you look at what's happened to the size of cabinet. It's not the be all and the end all of this, but it's certainly an indicator. We used to have cabinets. Sir John A. Macdonald governed with 13 cabinet ministers. Kenzie King fought a depression and a world war with 16. Lester Pearson built the modern welfare state with, I think it was maybe 20, 22. And now recent times, we've been up near 40. It's vastly large. It's the largest cabinet in the Western world, democratic world.
Why so many?
Well, because we're not using cabinet to govern. We're using cabinet to represent. Representation is supposed to be the job of the parliament.
But it's also the job of the cabinet minister. Cabinet minister is supposed to represent something, are they not?
Yeah, to a point. It's always been thus. Okay, you had to represent the different language groups, etc. I'm just saying you can take things too far. And 40 cabinet ministers, if you look around the world, is too far. Most countries, like the OECD average, is 19. So there's a balancing out there, and we've allowed the balance to slip out of whack, where we're not looking at what is an effective body with effective ministers to govern the country. And by effective ministers and by an effective body, I mean a body that is itself also something of a check on the prime minister. We have cabinet government as an alternative to one-man rule. And so in a properly functioning cabinet system, the prime minister may not be the classic idea of first among equals, but nevertheless, he has to take into account the views and roles of the other cabinet ministers. And he can't just run roughshod over them. He's got to think, okay, if I do this, cabinet minister A is going to be really upset. He may even leave cabinet, so I can't really do that. Nevertheless, if I back off too from that cabinet minister B is going to be sad and upset. So I've got to find some way to balance between them. That's part of the art of governing, is finding these balances. What's happened is, because the cabinet has grown so large, because it's ceased to become a functioning body as a group, anybody who's ever sat in a committee knows once you get past about 12, it really starts to get pretty unruly and hard to get anything done. I cannot find a picture of the Canadian cabinet in session in recent decades. I think they've put out a kibosh. You cannot publish this because it would look like what it is. It would look ridiculous. So collectively, it ceases to be functional. And individually, the ministers come and go at such rapidity. They have these invented titles that don't have any enduring relevance. A lot of times there's overlap between them, so it's unclear who's really responsible for which file. The prime minister just basically ignores them. Even the most senior cabinet ministers, it's quite plaintive. You read the memoirs of ministers in the Justin Trudeau cabinet.
Bill Morneau.
Bill Morneau, the finance minister, Mark Garneau, the foreign affairs minister, Jody Wilson-Raybould, the justice minister and attorney general. These used to be positions of some renown. And the theme that runs through them is, the prime minister had no use for my advice. I couldn't even get a meeting. The exception would be Jody Wilson-Raybould, who had all too many meetings with him because he was trying to lean on her to interfere in a criminal prosecution. But generally, the theme you hear, and this is not just those three, but other ministers, is the prime minister had no use for my advice. I was just basically there as a figurehead. And concomitant with that, we've seen the growth of the prime minister's office. This prime minister's office now is a staff of 120. Again, I would make an argument it's the largest comparable body in any parliamentary democracy. And that's where real power lies now, is with the prime minister's staff, with the prime minister's office and the privy council office, which are the senior bureaucrats. It's not with the elected cabinet ministers.
It's to the point, and I found this astonishing, that these cabinet ministers aren't even hiring their own chiefs of staff.
Yeah, it is really remarkable. There was a controversy in Britain a few years back where Boris Johnson, who, was a controversy in himself, but he was having a feud with his Chancellor of the Exchequer,
Javid,
and his staff said to him, "Oh, we think we'd like to appoint your senior advisors, please." And Javid resigned on the spot. He said no self-respecting cabinet minister would accept this kind of treatment. Rightly so. In Canada, in recent years and decades, it's become the norm. It's been sort of creeping up. For some decades, there's been some toing and froing in the hiring of chiefs of staff, but it's now pretty much obligatory that just all the chiefs of staff are chosen by the prime minister. So who are they reporting to? They're not reporting to the minister. They're reporting to the prime minister. Who is the minister relying on? The chief of staff is supposed to be the person they can most trust and work hand in glove with and be assured that they've got their back. And basically, what they've got is a spy from the prime minister's office.
What do we lose by having these neutered cabinet ministers?
We lose the sort of gentle check on the prime minister's government, even though they are advisors to the prime minister. When there's a give and take and when there's a more genuine cabinet government, then you're getting some kind of check on the prime minister's office. And then add to that, you're getting a range of different viewpoints. Oftentimes in a functioning system, you've got different ministers will represent different wings of the party, different tendencies, different viewpoints, different life experiences, of course, as well. But when you have powerful ministers who can bring those perspectives to bear, I think you get better decision making. Right now, what we're trying to do is run everything through the prime minister's office, which is just bizarre. It's elementary management theory that the larger the organization, the more you got to delegate authority. You might start off as a mom and pop shop, but as your company grows, you've got to delegate. We've done the opposite. The bigger our governments have become, the more intrusive, the more different types of areas of life they've sought to regulate or to subsidize or to control, the more that we've vested all the power in a handful of advisors around the prime minister. And I think you really saw that in the Justin Trudeau government. Towards the end there, they just looked exhausted. They looked paralyzed and overwhelmed. You saw it in things like there was this huge backlog in appointing judges and senior officials because everything was stacked up over the prime minister's office.
You regard the inordinate amount of applause heard in the House of Commons as the canary in the coal mine. It's the sign that we have a real problem in this country. You call it a disease. Why should we be so concerned about that?
Well, it is indicative, isn't it? You don't see it elsewhere. Applause has been banned in the British House of Commons for 300 years. All you do in the British Parliament is you sort of mutter, yeah, yeah, when you like a point that somebody's been making. Contrast that to the Canadian Parliament, where every few sentences, particularly when a leader of the party is speaking, his whole caucus jumps up to applaud. This is not normal. People don't do that normally. And when they are doing abnormal things, it's worth asking why. Well, one reason is no one wants to be the person who's not jumping up. Well, why is that? Well, because they're terrified of the leader. This is a kind of a loyalty exercise that's performed every day in full view of the public, where you have to kind of debase yourself in this way because it really looks, supine to be jumping up and applauding at the most banal statements. I mean, once in a while, yeah, but it's not like these are earth-shattering events. It's just they're required to do it. And we see this, I'm not trying to draw invidious comparisons, but you see this in dictatorships, this kind of flowery, over-the-top, exaggerated shows of loyalty to the leader. The members of parliament, who are supposed to be people with some power, are in fact the most powerless. They're the ones who are most required to make these stagey displays. It just shows you how low their status is sunk.
As we just heard, you're critical of the theatrics that take place in Parliament, and yet you insist that Parliament is supposed to be theatre. But it seems as if you want that theatre to be reimagined.
That's right. It's bad theater. It's fake theater. The idea, however, that Parliament is a stage on which the controversies of the age are played out in front of us, I think is valid. So it's always going to be a little bit staged. Nobody would deny that because it is in public. But at its best, it's voicing people's fears. It's bringing forward controversies that maybe somebody would prefer weren't brought forward. It's giving representation to people who don't get a lot of representation in life, don't have a lot of power in their daily lives. It's acted out in front of us, partly to dramatize it for us, to get us as a public who have a million and one distractions in our life, to get us to pay attention to these things, to simplify it into a way that people who are busy with their own lives and aren't paying a lot of attention can understand at least the broad significance of it and the importance of it, and sometimes the urgency of it, to give them the broad outlines of the fight. So a parliament that can hold the public's imagination that people think is an important place is a precious thing, but that's not the parliament that we have.
Almost a quarter century ago, I think it was 2001, Jeffrey Simpson wrote about the fact that the prime ministership was becoming more of a dictatorship. The prime minister was more of a dictator. You talk about that throughout your book, the fact that there's so much concentration of power within the prime minister's role, within the prime minister's office. What then could be done to reduce that power, to limit the power of the prime minister?
Yeah, it's a very difficult question. We now look back on the Kretschmann government as the last hurrah of cabinet government. Got materially worse under Stephen Harper, and it got even worse under Justin Trudeau. So there does seem to be this kind of inevitable dynamic where it just seems to ratchet further and further into the prime minister's orbit. We'll see whether it changes under Mark Carney or not. I don't have a simple answer for you. I've got a series of things that might help. Cutting the cabinet in half, I think, starting from the top down, would help in terms of the role of cabinet ministers, would make ministers more important players in the system. Changing the way in which we elect the party leaders, making, the very least, giving caucus the power to remove a party leader. And for some reason or another, the conservatives broke through and eventually even adopted the power that said you could remove the party leader. Lo and behold, they removed Aaron O'Toole. And from that day forward, and certainly since they've now reiterated and taken the power again with regard to Pierre Poilievre, every conservative leader now is going to have to look over their shoulder and making sure that they're staying on side with caucus. Maybe that spreads to the other caucuses in time. The Liberals actually took a close look at it this time for the first time. Maybe that starts the ball rolling. Maybe if MPs have the power to remove their leader, maybe they start to say to themselves, you know what, I think I'd like to be able to ask my own questions in Parliament, thank you very much. I think I'd like to be able to make my own members' statements, thank you very much. And maybe we get over this kind of self-selection or learned helplessness where MPs see themselves as such nobodies, let alone how other people view them, that they don't feel they deserve to take on more power. And if MPs start to see themselves differently, maybe we start to look at them differently.
I'm going to suggest, Andrew Coyne, that this book of yours, The Crisis of Canadian Democracy, is not going to win you many friends with current parliamentarians. You make disparaging remarks about MPs. You call them nobodies. You talk about cabinet ministers not having any real power. And you also talk about the Senate. You describe the Senate as, quote, the appendix of Confederation, a largely inert organ of uncertain purpose. Why do you think the Senate really actually poses a danger to the democracy?
Look, it's not because there aren't some good people in the Senate. There's also been a lot of bad people in the Senate over the years, because they could be of any character or whatever, and as long as the prime minister saw fit to appoint them, in they went. Again, appointed upper houses are extremely rare, needless to say. One of the few that comes to mind would be the British House of Lords. If you go back to 1958, the percentage of appointments to the House of Lords that came from the party of the prime minister that appointed them, I think was something like a little over half. In Canada, it's 99% or 98%. As usual, we've taken everything to this extreme where the Senate is just this hysterically patronage appointed house, and where oftentimes people had no qualifications, whatever. The idea was supposed to be that was going to keep the Senate in line. Well, right from the get-go, it didn't really quite work out that way. Senate, for the first decades of Confederation, quite regularly voted down government legislation, and particularly after there'd been a change of government, when there was an overhang of senators from the previous party, they had no compunction at all. It settled down in the mid-20th century, and they fell into this kind of somnolence where they really weren't really doing much of anything, which is hardly a great situation either, but I would argue preferable. But they've been starting to feel their oats in recent decades. And they've been asserting themselves more and more, and in ways that I think, frankly, are just fundamentally anti-democratic. You cannot have a body of unelected senators overruling the people's elected representatives.
But Andrew Coyne, maybe you're not appreciating the role that they're supposed to play. Senators. The Senate is supposed to be the chamber of sober second thought. It's supposed to protect the interests of smaller provinces. It's supposed to protect the interests of minorities. Alexis de Tocqueville in Democracy in America talks about the danger of the tyranny of the majority. The Senate is supposed to play the role of protecting, marginalized communities that might be abused by the majority.
Well, in my view, that's the role of the Charter of Rights and the Constitution and the courts, and which is a very different kettle of fish. And again, the Fathers' Confederation saw a very limited role for the Senate. I would argue there should be almost no role for an unelected body, at least as it regards overturning legislation passed by the House of Commons. Either we believe in democracy or we don't. By what theory of democracy can a bunch of partisan appointments assume the power that, that's like 53 senators should have the same power as the MPs elected by tens of millions of Canadians? That makes no sense whatsoever.
But the idea is that these folks are supposed to have some kind of moral suasion because they are esteemed people. They've done things in their lives. They're supposed to be above the fray somehow, and trying to protect the commons. Like they're trying to protect the institutions of the society. So they have the best interests of the society at heart. And so they're not expected to exercise these powers all the time. They're supposed to use their discretion. And when those minorities need to be protected, that's when the senators are supposed to intervene.
That's not what they've actually done. That's not been the role the senators played. It's either been a rubber stamp for the government if it agreed with the government of the day, or it was a partisan body for making mischief with the government. It's not ever really played that role of representing the less populous regions, for example, which is one of the reasons why the provinces have become so obstreperous over there, provincial governments, because there hasn't been this effective body, this effective counterweight in Ottawa that an elected Senate might be for representing the less populous regions. And so the provincial premiers have stepped up, I would say illegitimately, into basically setting themselves up as a permanent opposition to the federal government. I think provincial premiers should mind their own business in their own jurisdiction. But to come back to your point about moral suasion, there's a version of the Senate I can get behind. So Justin Trudeau did this thing where he appointed a bunch of people supposedly on a nonpartisan basis. Again, it wasn't really that. They might not have been card-carrying liberals, but they were certainly pretty reliably progressive. Increasingly, towards the end of his term, they were partisan liberals. But what we saw is senators getting more and more uppity about, well, I'm not just a partisan appointment. I have a mandate of virtue. I'm here because of my manifest character and achievements, etc. Well, that's really dangerous. But supposing you said the Senate cannot defeat a bill of the House of Commons under any circumstance, and you don't need a constitutional amendment to do that. The Senate itself could pass its own standing orders to say words to the effect of any bill passed by the House of Commons that has not passed the Senate within 6 months shall be deemed to have passed. So it would be a suspensive veto rather than an actual veto, which is like what they now have for constitutional amendments. So supposing you did that, and supposing you really appointed what you were suggesting, people of the first water, people of the most respected and indeed revered members of the community, I see some virtue in that idea where you'd have a body of people where the whole was greater than the sum of the parts. The collected voices of these very respected people would have strictly moral power. And that I kind of like. I think that's quite a subtle idea, is they would be able to weigh in and say, this bill we think is an abomination for this, and this reason. They wouldn't have the power to defeat it. But if they had a high enough standing in the community, if they were really top appointments and behaved themselves, they would have real moral force that a government would hesitate to go against. And I think that might be the best way to square that particular circle.
60 years ago, George Grant wrote his book, Lament for a Nation. Your book is a bit of a lament as well. You talk about the fact that, you rail against the fact that there's this culture of lying, you say, that has overtaken our politics. Can you elaborate on that?
Yeah, I mean, look, politics has always been a pretty seamy game. At its best, it involves a lot of slipperiness and duplicity, but in the service of a higher end. Because human societies are complex and it's not always easy to just take the straight and narrow. And I cut politicians a certain amount of slack. I don't think it's realistic to think they're going to be just Dudley Do-Rights all the time. But again, we've taken it to just an extreme. We have had a series of situations in Canada at both the federal and the provincial level where people have gotten elected where it wasn't just a stray slip of the lip or page 49 of their platform, but it was the central campaign plank of their election. It was the reason they got elected, and they turn around and do the exact opposite when they get into power. Go back to Pierre Trudeau with wage and price controls, for example, or Jacques Chrétien with, scrap the GST and renegotiate NAFTA, and on and on and on.
But there's an argument for Trudeau, though, in 74. Right?
Well, what's the argument?
Well, the argument is that things changed when he got into office.
But
the argument was that inflation was at 12%. You can also make the argument that other international actors, Richard Nixon at the time, was moving in that direction. That Trudeau felt the pressure from international actors, perhaps felt also pressure from economists and other folks who were saying that these are the numbers. You have to make this shift. Robert Stanfield at the time was going after him, and he felt that maybe politically he needed to capitulate. So you can make the argument that he didn't intend to mislead. So to suggest that he was lying is rather harsh.
Okay, well, you can make the argument once. Maybe in that case, I would argue differently with you. I think there's a reason why John Turner resigned as finance minister, for example. But After about the 12th or 13th or 49th or 50th example, then you start to say, no, there's something structural here, that we've allowed the idea that you can say one thing and do an entirely opposite thing to take root in Canada. So, well, I grant you, there are going to be cases where situations are radically different once you get in, but that does not apply to a lot of the cases. And I list a lot of them in the book. I think it's much more cultural that people have gotten away with it. People have shrugged at it. Again, we've kind of educated our standards to a level where we all just go, okay, what else do we expect them to do? Occasionally they pay a price. When Gordon Campbell, for example, said, well, we will never harmonize with the GST, and then did it once he got elected, 6 months later, it's hard to argue things had changed there. It's just he said one thing and did another because it was convenient. And he did pay the price, but all too often they don't. And it's not reasonable to ask the public to be the enforcers of this 4 years later when there might be 49 other issues on the election agenda. We should be able to take it as a given that the people who are running for office are not going to just flat out lie to us. The dilemma I think you really have to address is, what do we do about the good guys? How does a person who's actually telling the truth differentiate themselves from all the others? Because what happens is we all assume that they're all lying to us all the time, which is a terrible state to be in. One of the things I thought about was, what do we do in private life when we're faced in a similar situation? We're in a business that has perhaps an unfortunate reputation. We want to emphasize that we're on the level. Well, we've evolved a few things over time. We've got money back guarantees or bonded couriers or these kinds of things where we assume consequences if we're not telling the truth. Or similarly, in the legal world, we've got affidavits and swearing oaths. Is it that inconceivable that you could apply something like this to the political world where, as a voluntary matter, a leader or a candidate or a party could bring upon themselves legal consequence? So you'd have a provision in the Elections Act where they could say, in releasing my platform today, I invoke, Section 12 of the Elections Act, and that would spell out what the consequences were if we weren't telling the truth. It would naturally lead people to hedge and to put conditions around their promises. I think that's fine. I think that's all the good. I think it's responsible and adult to say we're going to balance the budget, unless we get into a recession or unless, certain circumstances apply. Again, that's what happens in the outside world. So I think there's something to be explored there. It may or may not hold water, but I don't think it's tenable just to tell ourselves it's perfectly okay for the people who we elect, the people who are working for us, to lie through their teeth to us every time.
You cover a lot of ground in this book of yours, and we can't get to everything. But one thing that I felt was a rather glaring omission was that you didn't talk about income inequality. You didn't talk about the effect that that has on societies and the disillusionment that people can feel when they believe that the system is fundamentally rigged.
That's certainly a fair criticism, and you can't cover everything. Mostly this book is fairly limited in its aims. It's quite broad reaching, as you say, but mostly what I'm trying to do is to bring us back to a classical Westminster parliamentary democracy with a few modern changes. Where I think I might get closer to what you're saying, and as I say, I think it's a fair criticism overall, is on the section on mandatory voting. When we talk about turnout, low turnout is a problem in itself, I think. I think it reveals a real problem in the lack of confidence people have in the system. But what's particularly, I think, important about it is low turnout is lower amongst certain parts of society, parts of the population than amongst other, among young people, among people of minority races, among indigenous people. You're getting a very unrepresentative sample, to put it in a very dry sense, that these people who have perhaps more of an interest than anybody else in having somebody fighting on their side to kind of even the scales are not turning out themselves to vote in elections. Obviously, I'm not going to throw anybody in jail for not voting, but the experience in other countries, Australia, for example, is a gentle nudge. I think the fine in Australia is $20. It just creates an expectation and a convention that everybody votes. And when you look at the experience in Australia, up until 1920, they had turnout like ours, 58%. They brought in mandatory voting in 1924. They shot up to 95%, and it stayed there ever since. Well, wouldn't that be a remarkable, along with everything else that I'm talking about, a remarkable difference in the way our election worked if everybody voted and not just the affluent, if everybody felt they had a stake in it, if we were actually representing the public in the body that is supposed to represent them? Then that's not directly addressing the concern you're raising, but I think it is indirectly.
Andrew Coyne, it's so good of you to join us. Thanks so much for this.
My pleasure. It was a great interview.
You've been listening to In Bed with the Elephant, a production of Ricochet Media. Let us know what you think about our show by leaving a review on Apple Podcasts. You can follow the podcast on Apple, Spotify, Amazon, iHeartRadio, YouTube, or wherever you find your podcasts. The producer, editor, and sound engineer of In Bed with the Elephant is Dave Sarrazin. Executive producers, Ethan Cox and Andrea Houston. Music, Parker Harewood. Graphics, Connor Kaloran. I'm Adrian Harewood. See you next time.